Hey, Gwilym, how are you, mate?
I'm very well. I'm a bit worried about the last podcast we recorded, and I need to set the record straight.
Well, yeah, no, I was going to ask you about that because these things don't always go out in sequence, of course. So the last one could come out after this one, or
Well, in which case, I want to apologise for what's about to come. One or the other.
Didn't you say it was a mistake that you were getting married or something like that?
No, it's not what I said at all. That's what I'm really worried about. It's because you keep interrupting me. I said I made a terrible mistake, and all I was going to say is I've just had a coffee, and I'm going to be jumping around like a lunatic. And then we got a bit distracted, and then I excitedly announced I was getting married, and I suddenly thought, oh my God, people are going to link those two things together without all the bit in the middle about the cave. There's a bit about a cave as well, which I don't know where that came from. But anyway, funny enough, though, Lee, I've made a terrible mistake today, which I've just had another coffee, and they really are affecting me quite heavily at the moment. So I'm going to be bouncing around a bit.
But it's not, for the record, it's not a terrible mistake that you're getting married.
No, it's on purpose.
It's a good thing. Yeah, you're doing it deliberately. You've not been hoodwinked or anything like that. There's no coercion. Hey, you had a good night out last night, didn't you? I believe.
I missed you. One of our beloved guests, yes. Ryan Abbott, with his awesome book about robots and AI and law, did a launch. I think it's the third time it's been delayed at the House of Lords, which is very cool. I was just regaling you pre-recording with the vigor with which I was searched on the way in. So I'm still basically walking slightly bandy today. And I also took my padlock. I don't know what they thought I was. Well, then they thought I was going to lock myself to something, but I don't know how. How do you lock yourself to something with a padlock?
There are devices, aren't there? You've probably drafted a patent for one or two.
I've spoken like a true ex-punk. I can imagine if you had the right kind of piercing, but anyway.
I once got stopped from going into the Commons with a set of darts in my pocket, which I'd forgotten I had. So I made the machine go bleep, and there in my pocket was a set of darts.
That's a bit more difficult to explain away than the padlock, isn't it? Well, yeah, we missed you, Lee.
I know, yeah. Sorry, I couldn't make it. It was just some family stuff came up, and as you say, it'd been rearranged a couple of times, and I could do all of the earlier dates, and then couldn't make last night. So I did apologise to Ryan because he is a lovely, lovely guest to have on the podcast, and we must have him back again soon.
Lee Davis and Gwilym Roberts are the two IPs in a pod, and you are listening to a podcast on intellectual property, brought to you by the Chartered Institute of Patent Attorneys.
Anyway, we probably ought to talk a little bit about what we've got on today.
Let's.
Yeah, let's. So we're going to talk about the much heralded and much awaited Mercer review. The Mercer review of education, training, assessment, and all of those kinds of things. And we've got three guests who've all had involvement in putting the review together, as did I. So there are effectively four of us who are experts on the podcast, Gwilym. So it's just you today who isn't an expert.
Yeah, you mentioned beforehand that I'd be running this one. You gave me approximately 30 seconds.
It's your show. Anyway, let's get our guests to introduce themselves. So first of all, named after the review, or the review named after him. I can't remember which way around it was. Probably the review was named after you, Chris, wasn't it? Chris Mercer, welcome. Chris, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you?
Hello. Yes, I think that I put my hand up at the wrong time, which is why the review is named after me. So I have been a patent attorney for longer than most people have been alive. I used to work for Cartmales and Ransford. I'm now independent consultant. I'm also a member of council, and I've been doing things educational ever since I started in the profession, I think.
Yeah, I was doing a little bit of research today for a future podcast, and you're one of 7 Cartmales people who have been president of CIPA, I learned today. Good show that. And actually, I remember very well the reason why the review is in your name, and that was because we were sat in CIPA in some room or other. And I remember saying to the group that these things always have much more purchase if they've got someone's name in front of them rather than just it's a review. And I think you put your hand up at about that time, probably to ask for a coffee or something like that. But
no, there was that meeting before that, Lee, where you said if we call it the Mercer review, you'll have to do it, won't he?
Thank you.
We've also got someone else who was present in that room at that time, Vicki Salmon. Vicki Salmon, who's council member, chair of our education committee. But Vicki, introduce yourself.
Thanks, Lee. I started in the profession also a very, very long time ago, and then moved from being a patent attorney into a law firm. Having started doing a few things with the informals, the great Tibble Gold hooked me into joining council, and so I've been on it for a while. I did run the litigation committee until a couple of years ago, and decided it was time for a change, and you suggested I come and take the education committee.
That's a nice easy gig, I think I said.
You said there was going to be no work, and then immediately this review kicked off, and then Chris stepped forward and I was able to duck most of it, so I think I've done quite well.
Yeah.
So I've just been setting up a new business, so we've got a new practice going on now.
Go on, plug it. Go on.
Plug it. Impact intellectual property. Just started, got offices in Clerkenwell, and it's jolly exciting. We're having a fantastic time finding our feet and working out how to get things going.
So from two, I won't say old timers, that would be a horrible thing to say, wouldn't it? From two seasoned patent attorneys,
legends of the profession.
Legends of the game, to someone right at the other end, starting out on the path to patent attorney greatness, the new informals on set, Lindsay Pike. Lindsay, really, really pleased to welcome you to the podcast. So tell us all about you. How long have you been doing this gig?
Thanks, Lee. It's really nice to be here for the first time. So I joined the profession in January 2020. We all know what happened not too long after that. So I had approximately 8 weeks of commuting to London from Cambridge, very keen new trainee, and then spent a year and a half working from home. So certainly not the typical early trainee experience, I think. But I've really enjoyed everything so far, and getting my feet on the ground. And as you say, yes, I'm now the Informals Honorary Secretary for the year ahead, so 2021 and 2022. And was also on the Mercer Review Group as well last year, helping with some of the chapters, particularly relating to training.
So there you go, Gwilym. 4 of us in the room, in the Zoom room, that have got involvement in the Mercer Review. I could ask you to drive now, or I could carry on. What do you want to do?
I can drive.
Go on,
I'm not just a sidekick. As you know, Lee, I'm looking for a way to take over anyway, and this is my moment. It's like a kind of a little, like an extended job interview for me. So there we go. I was going to start actually by talking about what occasioned it in the first place. I mean, like it or not, our exams, they're terrifying, but they're quite well regarded internationally as creating a fantastic profession. The tough exams are tough, and we've all been through them. But on the other hand, of course, you come out of it, and there was a lot of respect around the world. We had exams that kind of had that reputation. So what needed changing?
I'm actually going to say I think there was probably a bit more to it than that, because the Education Committee had stopped for a little while. And so we were just kind of restarting it and thinking about what the Education Committee should be doing. And we had the Middlesex review, which hadn't moved forward. And it was necessary really to sort out a programme for the Education Committee and what it should be doing. And I think that we were beginning to think about where that might go when there was the big outcry on the 2018 FD4 paper and some of the issues around it. And it became even more important to look at everything, not just FD4, but how everybody gets into the profession, how things have changed over the last years. And I think it was also really important that before, and maybe Lee will say a bit about the alphabet spaghetti shortly, but before the regulator decided to come at us again with another education programme, which they had done a few years earlier, I thought it was really important that we had some views as to what we thought patent attorneys ought to know and think about what the formation should be. So I think that was kind of rumbling along before we even got to the big kickoff of the Mercer Review. Would you agree, Lee, Chris?
Yeah, I think so. I think I'd go a little bit further, and maybe this is where I touch on the alphabetti spaghetti, Vicki. I mean, there were lots of things happening at the time we decided to think about the review. There was the debate, discussion around FD4 and other aspects of the examination system. But ever since I joined, I'm almost 10 years into CIPA now. And one of the first things that I found the whole training assessment thing really confusing, because it didn't look like anything that I'd seen before. And I think that that's probably what people experience when they come into it. You've got CIPA sitting somewhere in all of this, with its responsibility as the approved regulator, but not allowed to do the regulation. It has to delegate that. So it delegates its regulation to IPREG. So IPREG, if you like, is the guardian of the standards, is the guardian of the threshold that people have to cross. But IPREG doesn't set the examinations. It looks for a third party to do that. There used to be a joint examining board, or many will remember that piece of cooperation between CIPA and CIPMA as it is now, but that went by the way some years ago. So we created the Patent Examination Board. That sits separately from IPREG, but it also is meant to sit separately from CIPA, but it doesn't properly sit separately from CIPA because it is part of CIPA and then it's a committee of CIPA. So it's all, I think the whole landscape is a little bit cluttered and a little bit confusing for people. So we really did want to try and sort that out, and there are some strands that run through the Mercer Review that are about the governance, if you like, of the regulatory side. But also, it's not all about regulation. We often focus on the regulatory bit, because that's the bit that makes the most noise. Students get very focused on the examinations when they're in them. It becomes the big hot potato of the time. But we do other stuff. We provide career-long learning for our members, so continuing professional development, webinars, seminars, all those kinds of things. And I think it was really important that the Mercer Review took a holistic look at all of this. It wasn't just about the regulatory stuff. It was about the whole education landscape.
I think the other thing, Lee, which developed, in fact, from the change of the way council is elected and everything else, was that we also got into the council meeting views of younger members of the profession. So Lindsay's predecessors were co-opted by you onto council, and we then got a lot more direct input from the younger members of council about what was, concerning them, and things like training, how people found out what sort of training they might get before they even got the job was brought to our attention, which is another strand of the whole thing as well.
Absolutely. And I think that having that voice on council has been a bit of a shock at times. So, Lindsay, tough act to follow in terms of you now being on council and shaking things up, but you need to.
See what I can do.
Lindsay, how are you feeling about, sort of taking the Mercer Review out for a moment, just to remind us all how it feels like with those exams, kind of the next, presumably one of the next big hurdles in your kind of future life, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. So I have done the QM course so far. So that was last year, September 2020. Now getting ready for the pre-EQE in March, then obviously the UK finals next October. So I've got a pretty big year and a half coming up, I think. It's certainly quite an overwhelming feeling. And I think from my own personal perspective, I've always liked to try and prepare as early as possible. And I think it can be a bit tricky to know what you need to start preparing and when, etc. So I definitely think one of the things that we've sort of touched on in the review is that it would be good to have more information available to new starters and people right at the beginnings of their careers about what is expected and where they can go to find these resources.
Yeah, as one took many years ago, I still remember. I don't remember about 2 years of my life, I have to say. That's in my time pre-internet. So I think you had to sit in the library to get hold of the books, and that weird library down on Chancery Lane for the oldsters. And again, before we kind of go into the review, does anyone get when before this kind of review? When's the last time there's a major overhaul of the exams? Does anyone know?
Well, I've sat on the education committee for many years. The exams have gone through different stages at different times. I think probably the last overhaul might be when all the papers got renumbered, when the PEB was formed, but I should think the papers stayed much the same. I think the previous overhaul, when I sat the papers, you had five 4-hour papers to do in a week. You had 2 drafting papers, 2 INV papers, and a practice paper, and you had to do them all in one go to get through. And the big overhaul, I think, was to reduce the INV down to 1. So we only ended up with P6 and not 2 infringement and validity papers. And the drafting was reduced to 1 draft. And we also then got an amendment paper. And then everything became modular and there was much more freedom. And I think somewhere around the same time, we also abolished the requirement to do 2 years in the profession between intermediate and finals. Because at the time, I remember the patent office was moving from London to Newport, and lots of people didn't want to move, and they all applied to become patent attorneys. And all these applications came into the education committee. I've been at the patent office for 10 years, and I've been in the patent profession for 1 year and 8 months and 9 days. And could I please have a waiver? Just going, or they've been there for 11 months and 2 weeks, and they were that short, and you just thought, this is ridiculous. But of course, you then don't foresee that everybody just piles into the exams even when they're not ready, just because of the advantage of getting through them sooner.
The other thing that came up with that was we were looked at by the competition people, and they decided that having time limits for taking the exam before you could take the exams was anti-competitive. And I think that was one of the reasons why we had to take out all the time limits.
Isn't that interesting? Because let's not get too far down that diversion. But I always, I remember failing those exams, and arguably maybe I took some too early. I'm not sure, or maybe I just failed because I couldn't do them. Whatever, failing them is really horrible, and I think raising people's expectations to take them super early it's good in one way, it opens it up, but it's pretty psychologically damaging when you quite often for the first time in your life fail a test. It's a weird feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I for myself, when I started sitting the papers and studying for it, I remember a huge difference in my outlook between trying to have a go at the papers a year too early and doing them a year later. There was all the difference in the world in terms of what I understood and what I realised I was supposed to be trying to achieve. So I think self-discipline is not a bad thing. Mind you, I didn't have to exercise it because I wasn't given the option.
I've got a question for Lee. I love asking Lee questions. This is really exciting. So, Lee, you obviously you're very well cited on a lot of the I'm going to call them competing organisations. That's to say, they're not obviously because they don't do patents, but you through MEMCOM and all the kind of membership stuff you do. Are our exams fundamentally weird out of interest? Do we have a special niche? Would you say?
I don't think the examinations are weird. I do think our approach to how we train and prepare people for them is distinct. Rather than it's not and it's not unique. And interestingly enough, the job that I did previously, so I was at the Institute for Learning previously, professional body for further education teachers and trainers, and that follows exactly the same model. So I was a further education teacher. People know, they've listened to the podcast, and now I'm a plumber by trade many years ago, and it was that I went in to teach. And no one teaches you how to teach. You're pretty much thrown in a classroom with a load of students. You've got qualified teachers around you that you can kind of ask questions of and stuff like that, but you get on and teach. And then they start to drip feed you some lessons and stuff like that. And then you start to take examinations, but you're training on the job, doing the job, being paid to do the job with all the pressures that the job brings, and training and having to qualify at the same time. So our approach isn't unique, but it is quite distinct in that respect. And most of the other professions don't train like that. Most of the other professions, you train pre-entry, and you come into the profession as the finished piece in terms of your qualifications, not in terms of your ability to do the job. You are qualified to do the job, not necessarily capable to do the job. And our model is quite different. It's got there are a lot of plus points. I'm absolutely convinced that by the time someone reaches the point of being qualified on the register, chartered patent attorney, they can do the job, and they can do the job really, really well, because of everything that they're exposed to. But it's a tough way to have to learn and qualify. It does put a huge amount of pressure on trainees, on students. You need to be self-serving. You need to be motivated. There are some support structures around you, but that varies from firm to firm, from industry to private practice. So, and I guess that's another thing that's always struck me about this, is the lack of uniformity across the piece. So that, and I think that came out in the Mercer review, that students in different firms, in different subsectors, if you like, of the patent attorney profession, get very, very different, and sometimes not the most supportive experiences. And we probably need to sort that out over time.
I mean, I found that was a really interesting balance, because on the one hand, if you made it all structured and you had to go into a training firm, you would be reducing the opportunities. And therefore, by allowing people to go and become the person in a department in industry who was then going to go and get the learning and do stuff, you increase the opportunities. But because those support structures aren't in place for that person, then there's far more onus on them to sort it out for themselves. And there's probably some more help we can supply. But I found it was a really interesting balance with the people going, well, thank goodness there's so many different routes in, because I wouldn't have got in on the other routes. But at the same time, having got in on one of those routes, you're now without support. But sometimes when you're in, you again get to move, and it's getting in can be so important.
Can I just answer your question a little bit further? Because and it'll take us perhaps into the detail of the review itself.
Please, yeah.
And it also comes back to the point about governance earlier. So one of the other areas where we're different is in this rather bizarre arrangement where we try and have some kind of separation between CIPA, IPREG, and the PEB. And the PEB has to have separate governance and separate finance structures and all those. It's absolutely bizarre that model exists. We know why it exists. We know it exists because we got really kind of hooked up and focused in on the need for independence of our regulator and so on. But if you look at all of the other regulated professions, I won't say there are none, but you struggle to find many, if any, who have this bizarre situation where the examining board has to appear to be entirely separate from the professional body. There is absolutely no reason why CIPA cannot provide the examinations for the students under license to IP Reg, being properly quality assured by IP Reg, and that breaches any kind of notion of independence of governance or of act or deed. That was a really big thing for me to come out of this review, because the structure that we have overcomplicates things. Students have enough to worry about just getting their heads around the examinations, not having to try and work out the examination structure. And if one of the things that we achieve out of the Mercer review is that we make more sense of the kind of overarching landscape, that'll do me.
Cool. And you've just done my job for me, as you normally do, actually. So you're doing my job for me, doing your job for you. But so let's dive in. I'm sure everyone listening to this has read every page of the Mercer review, but we have the Mercer of the Mercer review right here on this podcast. Chris, hit us with the bullet points. Tell us what the Mercer review is about.
Well, I think that the Mercer review was about, as we said, a just global review of everything to do with training, assessment, and continued training once you've passed the exams. There is also, as Lee said, the strand about alphabeti spaghetti, which we needed to sort out. But we were trying to take a sort of holistic view of basically the life of a person coming out of a university or wherever and deciding to become a patent attorney, and seeing how they go, what they need to learn, how they need to learn it, how they need to be assessed on it, and what they need to do to keep up to date. So it was that just sort of general, let's do it, the whole lot. Because that was so big, we had to divide it up into bits. So we did, skills and knowledge, training, assessment, and governance as separate strands, but they do all overlap. And so we couldn't treat all of them separately. We had to listen to what people were saying about the other bits and pieces in each of our separate groups. So that's basically it. Will that do for you?
That'll do. That's half of it. I remember, Lee, I've got an alphabeti spaghetti joke that I made up myself that I must do before we finish the podcast.
Do it now.
No. We've got to build this one up. We've got to build this up. Okay. It's big and it's good. But no. So Chris, the other half of it was what are the actual take homes? What are the key proposals that come out of the Mercer review?
Well, I think the key proposals are we need to sort out exactly who's in charge of what. So I think that's one of the biggest things. The other thing that I think that we need to do is at the other end is make sure that everybody who joins the profession knows what they've got to train for, knows how they can get the training. So that's something that everybody ought to know when they start. For CIPA, I think the big message is that we need to make sure that where we can, we are providing training to the appropriate standard. So those would be my messages, I think.
Lee?
Yeah, I was asked to summarise this because it's a big long review, and it's got a wealth of stuff in it that we needed to unpack. But I was asked to summarise it. I came up with 3 bullet points. I was asked what would be the most significant outcomes, so I came up with 3 bullet points. The first is that we achieve a common standard of assessment for all trainees, regardless of the training route taken, because we know our trainees come at it from different routes. Many do university courses, some don't. There's a mixed experience that they get in training. So I think it's really important that we arrive at a common standard of assessment, regardless of the route that a student takes. The second of my bullet points was a relevant curriculum, which prepares trainees for the demands of patent attorney practice now and in the future. So the review has to absolutely capture where we are now and where the profession is going. And then the third one is something we don't speak enough about, I think, and maybe it didn't come out strongly enough in the report itself, is that the system's got to be open and fair. It's got to promote diversity and inclusivity. All trainees have got to be equally prepared, regardless of where they work. And also, they need to expect that if they've got specific needs, that those needs will be met. So those were the 3 bullet points for me: common standards of assessment, relevant curriculum, open, fair.
Thank you. And that last one's really, really interesting. Certainly when I was doing those exams and the EQEs at the time as well, there's quite a Victorian vibe to the whole thing. And it's also a bit like SAS training. I mean, the sheer length of time you had to spend doing the exam. You felt like you had to use a snorkel because otherwise you didn't have time to breathe properly. I just made that up. That's a really strange image. You know what I mean? It was just so intense and exhausting and so unmatched to the real world where, if you're under that kind of pressure, I wouldn't want to take advice from anybody who's, basically doing things with a snorkel on. Perhaps, I mean, we're all talking about, this is people who did the exams a long time ago who've got governance in their heads, which I can promise you is not the highest priority for trainees. They don't really care who's doing it as long as it's a good exam and gets in the right place. But with all the right intentions in mind. But let's talk perhaps to Lindsay about the reaction so far and how it's come out. I mean, we all read IPCAT. They've been, again, cherished guests on this very podcast. And those of you brave enough to dive into the comments section of any IPCAT post will know it's a terrifying place. Lindsay, how's the response been so far?
It's a very interesting question. I think you're right. There are a lot of interesting comments on there. I think they are, worth paying attention to. We've said that candidates get really bogged down in exams, and maybe that's not always the best way to be, or, over the course of your career, it's actually quite a short amount of time that you're in those exams, but they are so important. And I think a lot of candidates were really hoping that this review would come out a bit more. Some people have, I've got them up here actually. This was the chance to radically shake up the patent examination system. And you can understand why candidates want that, because I think there have been several years now where some of the exams have been quite controversial. We've talked in the report about exam creep, and the exams getting longer, supposedly to account for the amount of content, but then the content being increased to then match the amount of time. And you can understand why candidates are getting very upset about these matters, and would like to see something be changed. I think there is some miscommunication and misunderstanding about what role the report and the review group actually have. Obviously, we were kind of an independent group of people reviewing the responses, summarising the opinions from across the profession and making recommendations based on those. We're not the ones that are able to say, we're going to completely change the exam system. So some of the comments, I think, are a little bit misguided, but only from a lack of understanding that's maybe actually created from the complexity of the PEB and the CIPA and IPREG, as we've already discussed.
I think the exams, I'm personally a huge believer in not perpetuating the cycle of abuse. So, I do not accept the argument I had to do those exams and therefore everyone else has to go through exactly the same experience. I think we're all agreed that exams need to genuinely test your ability and make sure that you're fit for purpose. Like, I think we're just saying they don't need to test your endurance skills. That's a different job. And so hopefully that's something that, that is being fed in. But as you say, in the end, I guess the review could only summarize the responses it got. So if it didn't go further, that's because it wasn't driven to by the kind of evidence gathering phase. I think that's what you're saying, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a really nice place to kind of point out that a lot of the responses were entirely conflicting of each other. You'd get an opinion from one firm and then another firm would say something completely different, or one trainee would say something, another trainee would say something completely different. Even within the group, I might say something, Vicki might disagree. We had a lot of conversations where we really had to work very, very hard to come up with consensus summaries of the opinions and consensus opinions of our own as well to produce those recommendations. It was not an easy task.
There's some information sharing coming up. Well, I guess that depends when this podcast goes out. But Lee, what's the plan there? CIPA's got something coming up, hasn't it?
We have a webinar coming up. Actually, Gwilym, by the time the podcast hits the airwaves, we probably would have had the webinar because it's this.
How good will it have been, Lee?
Oh, it'll be absolutely amazing. We've got a brilliant panel. I wouldn't want to tell you who they are, but they may be largely the people here now. This time we're going to be able to, obviously the podcast is the podcast is a communication tool, isn't it? This is us broadcasting, whereas on the webinar, we've got the opportunity to engage with the people who are participating. So we'll be able to get lots of questions. We'll be able to get the sorts of feedback that's coming through the IPCAT, but also that people haven't had the opportunity to ask so far. So I'm really looking forward to the webinar because it's a chance to just open up this conversation to the next stage. And I know we're not at the end of this podcast yet, Gwilym, but you've asked a question. So in terms of what happens next,
He can't help it, can he? He won't let me drive. He won't let me drive.
I mean, what happens next in terms of the Mercer review? It's published. That's where it is. The review group has done its piece. It's delivered the Mercer review. CIPA Council needs to look at it and to interpret it and to determine what it's able to do to bring some of those recommendations into being. But also, we've got some big stakeholders in this. We've got IPREG. We've got the PEB as it is currently separate, largely from CIPA and needing to take some actions in all of this. And I'll speak in quite kind of tough language now. This isn't something that sits on a shelf now and people can have a little gripe about or whinge about now and then. This has to be something that all of the main stakeholders now take forward, have that conversation, decide what each of us can do, and actually bring about some change. So one of the outcomes of this podcast, one of the outcomes of the webinar, when we do it this Friday, is that we have to engage with every stakeholder, from the individual student who is looking forward to taking these exams sometimes in the future, to the seasoned professional who's taken them many years in the past and has views on them, through to the regulatory bit, to the PEB, the IPO will have a view on this. Everyone must come in and have their say so that we can actually deliver some change. That the review group's done its piece, and it is getting some flack for doing that, but it did the very best job it could do with all of the evidence available, and that was to say, these are the big issues. We've now got to sort them out.
I felt that we should have some short, medium and long-term issues coming out of this review. And for some of the short-term things, I think work already started on them, even if they haven't completely come to fruition. The patents manual has been rewritten and is due out soon, or may even be out by the time the podcast comes out. There is work going on a trademarks manual and a designs manual. So the short term, CIPA can do things about education and providing more education. We've changed the shape of the website. So we've got ability to store lectures and talks and webinars. And the informals have put on a program for foundation level stuff. And the next part of that will be to try and produce some more advanced level tuition modules and what those might look like. And that is kind of short term. In the medium term, we can also kind of try and influence the PEB to sort out some of the things that are upsetting people most about the exams. But although people are hoping for immediate change as to what those exams are, actually there's a long run up to these exams, and people have legitimate expectations once they've got into the profession. And I just don't think you can change exams really, really quickly without causing a huge level of uncertainty and upset, because people need time to know what a mock looks like, what they're trying to teach to, what they're trying to learn to and produce. So you can't just change exams on the spin of a die. They take a while to talk about what they should be and then to implement them over time so people get what they're expecting without being too upset by the changes that are going on. And I think, Lee, I would just add, we are a profession of volunteers. Everyone on this Mercer review is a volunteer. We've all been trying to do our day jobs, setting up new practices, coping with the fallouts of a pandemic and getting everybody to work from home, making sure that people are not left on their own and calling them a lot to see how things are. And therefore, it has taken longer to do the review just because so much else landed on our plate and we couldn't get together for meetings in the same way. So I think if there are people out there who'd like to help deliver some of the training which they'd like to see the Institute provide, we would be delighted to hear.
Absolutely.
On that note, we do actually still need some volunteers to help organise the informals lectures this year. So if there is anyone listening who wants to be involved, please let me know.
quick out of the blocks there with that one. That cool. Well, that's I noticed that was one of the themes actually, was why the informals in arranging the lectures still. But yeah, there's a nice tradition behind that. I don't know if that's being looked at or not. I was gonna touch on. So I love the comments section of anything. Just read it, and it's this kind of well of rage and despair. Wherever you look, that's what comment sections are. I try not to read them, and then do it, and I get angry and desperate as well, actually. But there's a classic comment in IPCA here. It'll take another 10 years to implement any recommendations. What sort of timescales are we talking about here? Is it 10 years?
I think that's the problem that we have, is that I'm sure there's the will in CIPA, as Vicki was saying, to do things as quickly as possible and get things moving along. But we do have to get all the relevant bodies to, come on board, because even CIPA as itself cannot do anything about the exams, cannot do anything about the qualification level. That's all with IPREG and the PEB. So, all of those things are going to take time. Hopefully not very much time, but nonetheless, we have still got to have those conversations with lots of people, and we have got to persuade the other bodies to do things. So it's not just the will from the Mercer review people and CIPA. We've got to get everybody else to come in and join in with us. And that could take time.
And just thank you. And just touching on one point that's been mentioned a couple of times, and Lee and Vicki both mentioned it strongly. And this podcast has I think, always focused heavily on diversity and inclusivity, etc. I'm so pleased to see that's such a high priority to make sure that these exams are suitable for any person with the right entry qualifications. They're not going to be intimidating or confusing or a kind of an invisible barrier to entry to the profession. That's really exciting to hear.
I mean, it was really heartening. There were some comments about wanting the exams pushed into a shorter time frame or things, but other people were also saying how much they enjoyed the modular nature. They felt that because they could approach it in a modular fashion, they could carry on with caring responsibilities and everything else that was going on in their lives. But that was it. But at the same time, people were complaining that they felt pushed into doing too much at the same time, to which I'm going, but these people are taking it modular, why don't you? I've heard there's a lot of comments about suggestions that pay rates get tied to exams. I think pay rates are set by the market. If your employer's not paying you enough, go find another one. We're hiring.
I think it's not.
That was Impact IP. I think it was Impact IP.
I think it's, obviously a lot of the times when you are training, the pay rises very much are associated with those step ups in qualification. And so you can understand, of course, why people feel the need to get through those exams as quickly as possible in order to get the higher salaries. It's very understandable, but I do agree, and it is something that is mentioned in the report, is that we do kind of encourage that people do treat them more of the modular system that they are designed to be, so that people aren't under so much pressure in a single year or a single 18-month period to pass every single exam as quickly as possible.
Makes sense. So Lee, I've loved driving. I feel like it might be time, if you're going to continue the metaphor, for me to hand back the wheel.
Oh, does that mean I have to sort of scamper across your lap to the driving seat now? Come on, move over.
No, it's one of those learn the driver cars with dual controls, Lee. So
okay. Yeah. So that means you keep the steering wheel then.
Yeah,
because
you've got the brakes, Lee.
It's only foot pedals. Yeah, I just put the brake on. Fantastic. Well, thank you all for sharing your time with us. Really enjoyed being a kind of pseudo guest on the podcast this time. That was brilliant. You did brilliantly, Gwilym. So thank you for your driving expertise. Chris, Vicki, Lindsay, thank you for everything that you've said today. I know it probably just generates more questions, but that's good. That's what this should be about. So final question, Gwilym, you've left us hanging with your alphabetti spaghetti remark. I didn't forget it, mate. So what was it?
What's the best grain to make alphabetti spaghetti out of?
I don't know.
No, go on. No.
Spelt.
Oh dear.
Is it all your own work? Is it genuinely all your own work?
That's my own joke. I've been waiting for years to be able to tell it to somebody. So thank you for the opportunity, everybody.
You've absolutely missed your vocation.
Thank you for having us. It's been a pleasure listeing to your podcasts, and well done on your recent award.
Oh, Vicki, it's so kind of you to mention it.
That little thing. Fuck. These things happen. We're over it, aren't we, Lou? We'd barely ever send each other.
Yeah, never ever talk about it.
No. It's just a thing, It's just a lump of plastic with our name on saying best podcast. That's all it is.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.